Okay, we are back again. It's always good to see everyone. And so we are going to finish the second half of 1 Samuel 17. If you remember, in the first half, we had this battle that started to occur between the Philistines and Israel. Israel was at one end of this valley of Elah. Philistines were on the other. If you remember, for 40 days, the champion of the Philistines, named Goliath, would come and provoke and taunt the Jews and say, send out a champion, and whoever wins takes the spoils, as it were, right? And of course, the Jews were not moved to do that because all of them were absolutely preoccupied on the size of Goliath. Okay, therefore they were in a state of inaction. David is sent from his father's home because his three brothers are there in the battle, remember, or supposed battle, I guess. And he brings them food, and then he's standing amongst the battle group, and he observes Goliath, and he hears what Goliath is saying and challenging not only Israel, but Israel's God, Yahweh. And he basically says, looks around at them and says, why are you putting up with this? In essence. Of course, his oldest brother thinks that he's a, mouthy, insolent little brother, and of course tries to chastise him verbally for saying anything. But we find that the information, of course, they hear of a reward that would be for anyone that actually would go to battle with Goliath. And so basically we're starting in verse 31 of chapter 17, and you'll see how this turns out tonight. So let's read 31 through 39 first. So when the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you're not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you're but a youth, which while he has been a warrior from his youth. He's this grizzled champion warrior, and of course David looks like he's a young punk that doesn't know what the heck he's doing. We're going to see that he knows exactly what he's doing, more than anyone else in the army. Israeli army knows what they're doing. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion and a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David in his garments, armor, and put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with his own armor. Verse 39, David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. So David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them all off. Okay? Now, let's go through this. I think there's a lot of interesting things in this text that are frequently not pointed out when you get the Sunday school Bible felt board version of David and Goliath. Okay? Now, David speaks up, as we've seen, to his brothers at the battle group, and he tries to get the soldiers to see that this is both a spiritual in a military battle. But they don't see it that way. The only thing the Israeli army is looking at is the appalling size of Goliath. That's it. Okay? Purely visual, can't do it, too big, too strong, done. Okay? Now, remember though that David has a long legacy of faithful people in his lineage. Okay? His grandfather, whose name was Obed, is the son of the two faithful servants, Ruth and Boaz, who were known for their faithfulness in acting in faith and their ministry for people, for the poor, for Israel. You know, they're well known. And as we've looked at fourth chapter of Ruth, as we looked at some of these things before. Also, of course, Obed's grandmother was Rahab, okay, who was a faithful Gentile who absolutely defies the king of Jericho, is asking to be killed, hides the spies, okay, that come to her, and then sends the men from Jericho the wrong way so that the spies can go back to their camp. Of course, if the king of Jericho would have understood this, she would have been a dead woman. But instead, she asked for a grace. Remember? That there be a cord tied on the outside, presumably window of where she lived, her home, and that the Jews would be told when they came, okay, that this house was not to be touched. And indeed, that was the truth. Okay, even though the walls of Jericho fell down and they came in and conquered it, Rahab was saved through it. And of course, she marries, quote, a prince of Israel, and of course becomes a part of Israel spiritually. Okay, and of course, as we see, she's part of the lineage of Jesus Christ himself. So now, Saul is told David's words, as we see, about the giant, and he calls a meeting with David, and David offers to be Israel's champion. Now, Saul has a specific and understandable, in a sense, if you're looking at it superficially and not spiritually, hesitation about this plan. And he doubts David has any military capacity or training to do this. Okay? But David says a very interesting thing. David says that the Lord has prepared him for this. Now think about that. Okay? He says that when he would shepherd his father's flocks, that he would encounter at times either a bear or a lion, and that he was trained, we'll see his weapon, the sling, to kill them, which he claims that he had done, right? So he sees himself as ready for this event because God put him through experiences prior to this event that readied him, both spiritually and in terms of his military capacity with the sling.
It gives him confidence.
Yes. In other words, they look at him and think, this punk kid, there's no way he's going to get slaughtered.
Right.
But he looks at it from a spiritual standpoint, and he says, well, God's been training me to do this. Yes.
You know, I'm not sure punk kid is really should be the definition. If we were all to shoot a lion or a bear and stun it, and we come up on it, that thing is, I don't know if any man's going to go up there and grab it by the neck. So what kind of guy is that?
In his own training, of course, we are going to see how absolutely capable and prepared he was for this. This is why God allowed these things to happen to him as a shepherd.
You see? Big. He still must have been a big guy to get his hands around something like that, just to grab it.
We don't know his height exactly. We know that he doesn't fit in Saul's armor. We know that Saul is pretty large. We don't have his exact height that I remember, but he's, what is he at? A head above all others, okay? So, you know, I wouldn't presume, because he's probably in his 20s, that David would be necessarily small, but he certainly is not as tall as Saul.
Correct.
Okay? Now, so also in his training, obviously he's trained to be expert at using the sling. Now I want you to turn, if you would, to Judges chapter 20. Okay, so turn back past Joshua to Judges 20. Okay, come on. Not past Joshua, I'm sorry. Past Ruth to Judges 20. And I want you to look at what I think is an interesting verse. We've studied Judges before, and that is verse 16. This is speaking of the Benjamites. Okay? And we talked about the Benjamite War that occurred, the civil war where Israel was against the Benjamites because of what they did. And so we see here in verse 16, talking about the Benjamite tribe. Out of all these people, 700 choice men were left-handed, and each one could sling a stone at a hair and not miss it.
Wow,
That's good,
that is very good.
okay? And 700 of them were in the tribal militia of Benjamin and could do this. Now, it doesn't tell us directly that David picked up training here, but if you look at a map, how far is it from where David is to Benjamin, tribe Benjamin? It's like next door,
Oh,
very close. So we can't prove it, but it's not unlikely that this may be where he learned his capacity, okay? This is some sort of interaction with some of these Benjamite slingers, okay?
This is according to Saul.
Now, there's an interesting a quote by a Messianic Jewish rabbi of the past. His name is Alfred Edersheim. And here's what he says. I think he puts it well. He says, the first demand upon us as the believer is to be spiritual in our view. The next is to be genuine and true without seeking to clothe ourselves in any armor. Now, before we started tonight, Michael and I were talking here, and he made a very good point. And that is, we were talking about having a spiritual view as opposed to having a material view. What'd you say, Mike?
I said because of the fact that we are flesh and we are earthbound, more or less, we tend to look at that first,
Right.
at the obvious, the fleshly, the things in front of us, as opposed to any spiritual viewpoint, even for the believer.
Right.
It's
Very
natural.
true.
It's just natural.
It's natural. It's the wrong natural, but it is natural. So we all struggle with that, you know. Now, the second issue is this. Think about David and being given Saul's armor, okay? He's being given the armor of an apostate, carnal, quote, anti-king named Saul, who has proven himself over and over again to not in any way be the type of king that God wanted, okay? Now, why would he therefore take on and employ the strategies of that type of man? Well, he wouldn't, because he isn't that type of man. He's a spiritual person, and he counts on the Lord, and he talks to the Lord, okay? Yes,
So
Steve.
did Saul have an ulterior motive? What he gave him his armor? I mean, obviously you would know that was too large and red before you put it on. But maybe but anyways, because they could have got somebody smaller armor just as easily. So did Saul want his armor on David if he was going out there for?
Possibly. Now, I'll tell you as we get towards the end of the chapter why that makes sense potentially, okay?
Probably Saul at this point was ready for just about,
Well,
anything.
Saul didn't have a better plan
That's what I'm saying.
at all, okay?
Sounds good to me.
But at the end, your point is well made, and at the end, we'll see why this may have occurred, okay? Now, David knows how the Lord has trained him, and both in his talent with the sling and in the faith to kill lions and bears. We see that in verses 34 through 37. And David sees Goliath as just another enemy to overcome. He is not looking at Goliath's height, but rather he's looking at his own training, and he's absolutely offended that Goliath, who claims Dagon as his demigod, would dare speak against Yahweh. He's furious about this. Okay? Nobody else seems to be furious about it, but he is. That's where he is spiritually. Now, Saul, of course, insists, as we've just said, about he trying on his armor, but both it didn't fit David, and I think another thing that's important is that this was not the strategy that God gave David. David was given a totally different strategy on how to overcome this giant, and that wasn't it. So he wasn't going to wear the armor. Okay? Now, let's go and read 40 through 49. Go back to 1 Samuel here. Okay. And he took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of the Philistine. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy. You know what that word means? Red-headed, okay, of some sort, with a handsome appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" You know what he's referring to?
Yeah.
His staff.
Yeah.
Well, you're going to beat me with your staff and this is going to do it, you know? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Underline that, because it's going to be a really key element in what we're going to see is going on in the next verses, okay? And the Philistine also came to David and said, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Verse 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin." Here's the key. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted." In other words, David's basically saying to him in faith, you're a dead man, because God is behind what is going on here, and you're going to die. That's really what David's saying to him. Okay? So 46, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army to the Philistines this day, so that the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Okay? "And that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear." He's talking now to the Israeli army. Okay? "That the Lord does not deliver by sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Then it happened, when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, so that he fell on his face to the ground. Underline, fell on his face to the ground. Okay? So, David obviously picked up his shepherd's gear, went to the brook that was in the valley there, the valley of Elah, okay? Found 5 smooth stones that were the ideal size for his sling. Now, what you're going to see here, I hope you see, is the 5 stones is a prophetic image.
Mhm.
And I'm going to show you why it's a prophetic image. It really happened, but it's also prophetic. It's typological for something else too, okay? So, obviously we know, because we know the end of the story, they only needed 1 to kill Goliath. This is Goliath of Gath. But let me show you why he took 5, okay? So turn, if you would, to 2 Samuel 21, over one book, 2 Samuel 21. And we'll start verse 18. Now this is after David has been declared king over all of Israel, okay? He now has a standing army. He has leaders in his military. He has a commanding general, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, now it came about after this that there was a war again with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai, the Hushathite, struck down Saph, who was among the descendants of the giant, okay? So one of them is named Saph, okay? Verse 19, then there was a war with the Philistines again at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jair Oregim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, not Goliath of Gath, Goliath of this town that he's a Gittite, okay? And the shaft again of his spear was like a weaver's beam. So again, what's it telling you?
Big.
He's a giant.
Mhm.
That's the second one now. We just talked about 2.
Is
Okay.
that almost sounds like God was directing the speaker too, or or the. Never mind.
Okay.
Keep going. I'm
All right.
sorry.
All
Never
right.
mind. Keep going.
Okay, verse 20. Now there was a war again, this time at Gath instead of Gob. And there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number. And he also had been born to the giant. Okay, you go, what giant? Well, in just a second. All right. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. Verse 22, these 4 were born to the giant in Gath. They're referring to the 4's father, who was a giant, okay, who lived in Gath. And they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants.
So 5
That-
total.
5 total. Now, we actually, interestingly, have the 5th one's name. If you want to dig around to obscure facts, which I actually like to do, so go to 1 Chronicles 20. The 5th one is actually named in 1 Chronicles 20. And we find it in verse 5. Now there was a war with the Philistines again. Elihan, the son of Jair, killed Lami. Now that's the 5th one. His name is Lami. Okay, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. All right, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And again, there was a war at Gath where a man of great stature who had 24 fingers and toes, 6 fingers on each hand and 6 fingers on each foot. And he also descended from the giants. And of course, then they killed him. So there's a father that has 5 sons. The father's a giant. He has 5 sons that are all giants. Okay? These are the 5 that David and his men killed in this time frame. Now, I think it's interesting that, sorry, I'm going to go to my next page here, that we see this inference, this statement, that these giants had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. Now, the interesting thing about that, and I won't take off on this very far, because if I take off here, look out, we're gonna be here for hours, okay? But you find that when large skeletons have been dug up, that are anywhere from 7 to 12 feet tall, and sometimes I should show you a variety of books that I have, and I know that he has them too, okay? And when you look at these things, going back into the 1850s, you have newspaper articles, and later in the 60s and 70s, pictures of these massive skeletons, many of whom have 6 fingers and 6 toes. And there are newspaper articles of people that have dug these out of the earth, hundreds of newspaper articles. I have a book back there by Steve Quayle that goes through hundreds of newspaper articles. He shows you the picture of the article. Some of them, again, have pictures of the giant itself. So the point is that we had, or possessed back then, clear archaeological evidence of giants. Now you ask the question, where are they now? And the answer to that is no one really knows. Because time after time, in these newspaper articles, the county medical coroner is brought in to examine the skeleton. He comes in, he measures it. He measures the femur, he measures, size around the head circumference. He measures it completely and declares that this is indeed anatomically a human type being, but huge. Okay? I mean, you read these articles, it's kind of interesting to read them. They're all over the Midwest. I mean, they're all over. And indeed, yes.
Did you happen to have time to look up my question that had to do with Noah and the ark? And
No, I didn't have time.
you understand what the question is again? How did they reappear? Where did they come from?
That is not exactly clear how they did, except for one phrase in Genesis 6, talking about them and their death that's going to occur in the flood, and it says, and thereafter. Now, there's various theories about what thereafter actually means literally. In other words,
Research that I can't find a lot on it.
There are theories that people have come up with.
Yeah, I've come up with theories.
Okay.
Nothing else.
But we're not told literally any more than they did indeed. Some survived. But even though they did survive, one of the things that's quite clear is that they never occurred at the same stature or in the same prevalence as they did in Genesis 6. So they got smaller and smaller.
They were never able to repopulate.
Yeah. Well, they did somewhat, but not a great amount. Remember, the Philistine only has 5 of them.
Right.
Okay. So, it's interesting. We have a newspaper article. I think it's from the Newark Advocate. I think that's where it's from. And it's about Homer, Ohio. Okay. And the article talks about this story.
You're talking about the gigantic Homer, right?
We're talking about a giant that was found in a mound in Homer. Okay. And it's told exactly where it existed. If you've ever been to Homer and you know where the cemetery is, it's just northeast of the cemetery. There was originally, before agricultural, there was a large mound, and 2 boys dug into it and found what the coroner medical authority there in the county, in Licking County, measured as a 12-foot skeleton. Okay? Big. And of course, then there was a newspaper article about the writer that talked about what they found and how they measured it and so on and all this. There's also a mound in Homer that's about 1.5 miles to the west of Homer. And in that mound, they dug out 7 7.5-foot skeletons too. Okay. Now, originally there were 20 mounds around Ohio. How do we know around Homer? How do we know that? Because we had these famous guys that in the 1840s mapped all the Ohio Valley. They mapped all the mounds, all the Indian villages, all the streams, all the rivers, and I can literally show you their maps. I have the book on their maps. So at any rate,
What did you pick up on the fact that they also found prehistoric animals?
yes, they have also found those. Johnstown, of course, most
Yes.
famous.
Yes,
So-
those were clients of mine, still are,
Really?
yeah,
Huh.
that dug those up.
Okay, let's move on here. So it says now that David ran towards the giant who, quote, disdained him. In other words, this champion of Israel is young. He's not that big, certainly compared to the giant, and he doesn't look anything like a warrior. I'm certain Goliath never saw a warrior with a shepherd's stick and a sling before. Okay, so he's going, what is this? And then commenting about his shepherd's staff, Goliath says, am I a dog that you're going to beat me with the staff? Okay, in other words, come on now. What are you doing this for? The key, of course, is verse 43, back here, where it says, and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. That's a very important verse. Now, what was the Philistine main god? You remember his name?
Dagon.
Dagon. He had the body of a, so let me think, did he have the body of a man, the head of a fish? Or the body of fish and head of a man? Well, one way or the other.
Yeah.
He was a hybrid, okay? He was a hybrid.
You'd be able to pick him out of a crowd.
Yeah, you sure would.
Mhm.
Now, we have previously seen a battle between God and Dagon. So let's go back and read it, and it'll make more sense to you. And that is, go back to chapter 5 of 1 Samuel. You need to understand this because you're going to see it replayed. Starting verse 1, 1 Samuel 5. Now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to Ebenezer and then to Ashdod. Ashdod's one of the 5 cities of the Philistines. Then the Philistines took the ark of the God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. What are they trying to prove? Because they captured the ark, what are they trying to prove, Bill? That
Dagon is greater.
Dagon is greater, right?
Yes.
All right, so it doesn't go so well for them though. Verse 3. When the Ashdodites arose early next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before, that is right in front of, the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and set him up in his place again. Okay? So they thought, well, this must be an error. Okay, so we'll just put him back and then he'll prevail. Verse 4, but when they rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face. Fallen how?
Face down.
Face down. Okay. Again, and to the ground before the ark of God, and the head of Dagon and both of the palms of his hands were cut off at the threshold. Okay, that is before the threshold going into the temple where Dagon was. Okay, now think about this for a minute. This is prophetic. We read it here in chapter 5. Okay, then what are we reading right now? The same thing. David sees that this is really a contest ultimately between Dagon and Yahweh. He sees that this is a spiritual battle more than even a physical battle. And of course, in verse 46, David promises he'll knock the giant down and remove his head. This is exactly what happened in the temple of Dagon. Okay, he falls over straight forward on his face, and his head pops off. So this is exactly what's going to happen to Goliath. He's going to fall straight forward in his face, and his head's going to come off. See how prophetic it is.
Well, David cuts his head off.
Yes, he does. He cuts his head off. Now, David knows, of course, the source of his deliverance is not swords or spears, but Yahweh, who will create this victory. So Goliath comes to attack David. David takes the stone, puts it in his sling. He revs it up to a proper acceleration and speed and releases it right into the only unprotected place on Goliath. That is his face and forehead. Okay? Now, the important thing to realize is that this stone could not have missed. There was zero chance it wouldn't go exactly the right place, because who was directing it? God. It was God's war. God was directing it, and so it was going to go exactly the right place to knock him out. And again, what do we see? We see that that he falls dead forward. Okay. Now it's interesting. Face down, just like Dagon did. Now, to put this in scientific terms, you don't mind if I do this because this is neuroscience and this is my thing. Okay. Okay. It caused a traumatic brain injury in Goliath in the prefrontal cortex of his brain. Okay. Now, when you have a major trauma to the prefrontal cortex, you become immediately unconscious and all your motor functions stop immediately. Therefore, you just fall dead forward. Boom. Okay. And that's exactly what we're seeing is described here. So, now let's go to, let's read verses 50 through 58. Go back to chapter 17. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand. And David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. When the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley to the gates of Ekron, and the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sharim, even to Gath and Ekron. And the sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps. Now remember that. Okay? They plundered their camps. You're going to see it in a way again. When David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. Now when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, his commander, that is the head general of his army, okay? Abner, whose son is this young man? And Abner said, by your life, O king, I do not know. I'll explain that in a minute. And the king said, you inquire whose son and the youth that this is. So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite.
I find this interesting in that David had already played and soothed Saul.
He had.
And Saul was clueless who David was.
Exactly. And we're going to talk about that, what the reasons probably are in a minute, okay? You're exactly right. So David had no sword, so he goes and gets Goliath's sword, and he cuts the head off the giant, leaving only the body. Now notice in verse 9 of this chapter, when Goliath asked for a champion-on-champion match, he said, and if your champion wins, then we will throw down our swords and become your servants, which they didn't do.
They did that.
But they did something that was nearly as stupid, okay? They turned their backs and ran. And at that point, particularly if you're footmen against footmen, they have spears, they have all the stuff, you're going to get slaughtered in that process. And that's exactly what it says, that they were dead all the way almost to the gates of those Philistine cities.
Did you understand that they had bow and arrows at that time? Have you read across that?
I think it's a little later in the Israeli army.
Okay.
They're not mentioned at this point. Okay, I think they're a little bit later technology. So now, the second thing that happens after they run down all the ones they can kill, the Philistines they can kill, is it says they come back to the Philistine camp where their military was on that one side of the valley, and then they come and raid the camp and they take away all the spoils of the camp. Okay, now keep that in mind. Now, David removes Goliath's armor and his head. 2, armor, head, okay, and puts them, quote, in his tent. This is not a great translation in English. It is the word in Hebrew, ohel, and it means a dwelling or a home compound. He wasn't talking about he took them to his little tent. What he's saying is he took them to his father Jesse's compound, and they were on display in his father Jesse's compound where all the brothers lived. Okay, that's where the armor stayed, at least for some period of time. Okay, but he takes Goliath's head to Jerusalem. Okay, now when he displays the head in Jerusalem to Abner, who's the head commander of Saul's army, they ask, who is this kid? Now, I think there's several reasons why they ask this. Abner may or may not have been familiar with David. Remember, David wasn't constantly in Saul's court. He would come sometimes, play the harp, but then he'd go back and shepherd his father's sheep. You know, it tells us he goes back and forth. It says it clearly, okay? But certainly Saul knew him, because, or should have known him. And I think one of the things that we can probably say is that David, being a spiritual person and having just done a spiritual action, and he followed the Lord absolutely to the letter, and God gave him the victory, he now comes upon a carnal and demon-possessed Saul. Now, we don't know how demented Saul is from the demon, but you're going to see as we go on a few more chapters, he's lost a lot of his marbles. Okay?
That's what I wondered.
He becomes increasingly paranoid, increasingly delusional, and undoubtedly his health goes down, as well as the fact that he's obviously now infested with this demon. And look what we see in the New Testament about demons. They can paralyze you. They can make you so you can't speak. Okay? They can give you illnesses. We have all these examples of David dealing with demonized people that have these different kinds of demons. So I think those are, again, some of the reasons probably why that was true.
Well, that's what I wondered.
Okay? Now, also, Saul now undoubtedly realizes that the reward he promised, he can't back down on, because David has become very quickly Israel's folk hero. I mean, David probably right now is more popular than Saul, easily. Okay? Now, if you were Abner and you were Saul and you saw this young man become outrageously popular among the people, having done an absolutely astounding thing, what would you think about him?
He's a threat. He's a threat.
Right, he's a threat. Okay, they're seeing him now as a rival. Okay, but or worse. Okay, so at any rate, you know, Saul has to follow through on the promise of the riches, marrying Saul's daughter, and also the tax-free status that he promised anyone that would overcome the champion. But David is a prominent citizen. And of course, he also, as we said, is a very big threat to Abner and Saul. Now, I want you to notice a parallel we're going to look at. I think it's an astounding parallel myself. And it's another example of what we've said many times. What begins as a shadow in the Old Testament becomes revealed in the New Testament. Okay? So this is a true story, but it's also a typology. It will have another, we'll have another experience with it in the future. So I want you to turn to Luke chapter 11. I find this pretty astounding as a spiritual application and as a incredible parallel. Luke 11, and we're going to start in verse 14. Now notice the context here. Okay? Let's talk about Jesus, starting 14. And he was casting out a demon, and it was dumb. That is, it wouldn't let the person speak. And it came about that when the demon had gone out, the dumb man spoke, and the multitudes marveled. And some of them said, he casts out demons by Beelzebul, the ruler of demons. And the others, to test him, were demanding of him a sign from heaven. And he knew their thoughts, and he said to them, any kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a house divided against itself falls. And if Satan also is divided against himself, how shall his kingdom stand? For you say that I cast out demons by Beelzebul. That's called the head of, they call him the head of demons, Beelzebul. Okay. And if I by Beelzebul cast out demons, by whom do your sons cast them out? Consequently, they shall be your judges. So he says, verse 20, if I cast out demons by the finger of God, his Father, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. How many kingdoms exist? Two. You're either in one or the other.
Right.
You're either a force in one or the other. You're either an entity in one or you're an entity in the other. There's nothing in between. Okay? And he says, now, these are the interesting verses, starting 21. I think we've all read this, but the question is, I think we've all struggled with what exactly does it mean. When a strong man, fully armed, guards his own homestead, his possessions are undisturbed. So, very strong person, or being fully armed, guarding his place, his region. Okay? And when some, verse 22, and when someone stronger attacks him and overpowers him, he takes away from him all of his, interesting word here, armor. Why does he use armor? On which he has relied, and distributes his plunder. Now, do you see the parallels between Goliath and David and what he just said here? Two strong people, both having their own kingdom or nation, okay? One is armed to the teeth. The other apparently is not armed to the teeth. But the stronger man takes on the strong man and whips him, okay? And therefore, he then imposes the stronger man's kingdom eventually on the world. Okay, well, let's go through it a little bit. Of course, the strong man we know is Satan. In his palace, his region, his area of control is the world system, right?
Yes.
He has armor, interestingly enough, just like we were told the believer has armor in Ephesians 6:10 through 12. I would suggest that Satan's armor are the fallen angels and the demons. Okay, I think that's his armor. Now, but he's overcome by a stronger man, Messiah, who is interestingly the descendant of who? His father, David. Now, Goliath was powered satanically by his demon god Dagon. Right? Okay. Just as Dagon fell forward and the head came off, God predetermined that this event that we find here in 1 Samuel 5 that we went to would be a pattern which would reoccur the first time in 1 Samuel 17, what we just went through. But it's going to occur again because what will happen is that they'll finally and completely, the stronger man, Messiah, will overcome the nations found in Revelation 19 when he returns to this earth. And what does it say he does to the nations?
Slaughter.
He slaughters the nations. Okay, they all end up, the soldiers dying, or but at any rate, they all are made subservient to Messiah, right? So, and Messiah conquers the nations. He also conquers Antichrist, another strong man of Satan, the false prophet, and eventually Satan himself. And they're all eventually contained in hell, never to affect God's kingdom again. Okay? Now, I think Luke 11 is an amazing parallel to both 1 Samuel 5 and 1 Samuel 17. Again, always look for typologies because there's lots of them in the Bible, lots of them. And it helps show you God's intent and God's will and gives you really a greater understanding.
Yes.
Yes.
They were also shepherds.
Yes, that's true. Good point. That as Jesus was a shepherd of his father's people, David was a shepherd of his father's sheep. You know, so there's more analogies you can do here, but I just want to show you those. Okay, so that's the 17th chapter. So now we're going to move on to the 18th chapter, and we're going to see this turning of events which occurs. And I think it's because of exactly what we've seen here in chapter 17 and what we've just said about who David now appears to be to Abner and Saul. Now we're going to see that Saul does not, let's say, semi-politely accept the ministry of David in calming him down. Now we're going to begin to see in the next chapters that's not what Saul's going to do with David. Okay? The demon's going to incite him into a lot more different things. Right? Okay. So let me pray and we'll close. Lord, thank you for this night. Thank you for your scripture again. Thank you for revealing these things to us in your scripture, showing us patterns. We know that in the language that you chose to write the Old Testament in Hebrew, that is indeed a language of patterns and images. And they're brilliantly brought out in your word here in the Old Testament. So we thank you for these things. We continue to pray for understanding in them. And we pray in Christ's name. Amen.